Dracula is a novel by Bram Stoker, published in 1897. An epistolary novel. The narrative is related through letters, diary entries, and newspaper articles. It has no single protagonist, but opens with solicitor Jonathan Harker taking a business trip to stay at the castle of a Transylvanian nobleman, Count Dracula. Harker escapes the castle after discovering that Dracula is a vampire, and the Count moves to England and plagues the seaside town of Whitby. A small group, led by Abraham Van Helsing, hunt Dracula and, in the end, kill him. Dracula was mostly written in the 1890s. Stoker produced over 100 pages of notes for the novel, drawing extensively from Transylvanian folklore and history. Some scholars have suggested that the character of Dracula was inspired by historical figures like the Wallachian Prince Vlad the Impaler or the Countess Elizabeth Bathory, or even Irish literary or folklore antecedents, like Carmilla or the Abhartach, but there is widespread disagreement. Other scholars point out that the real source for Dracula was much closer to home. The name Dracula, which is now primarily known as the name of a vampire, was for centuries known as the sobriquet of Vlad III. Diplomatic reports and popular stories referred to him as Dracula, Dracuglia, or Dracula already in the 15th century. He himself signed his two letters as Dracula or Draculia in the late 1470s. His name had its origin in the sobriquet of his father, Vlad Dracul, Vlad the Dragon in medieval Romanian, who received it after he became a member of the Order of the Dragon. Dracula is the Slavonic genitive form of Dracul, meaning, the son, of Dracul, or the dragon. In modern Romanian, Dracul means the devil, which contributed to Vlad's reputation. Vlad III is known as Vlad or Vlad the Impaler, in Romanian historiography. This sobriquet is connected to the impalement that was his favorite method of execution. The Ottoman writer Tursun Beg referred to him as Kazik, voivoda, impaler lord, around 1500. Mircea the Shepherd, voivode of Wallachia, used this sobriquet when referring to Vlad III in a letter of grant on 1 April 1551. The stories about Vlad made him the best-known medieval ruler of the Romanian lands in Europe. However, Bram Stoker's was the first book to make a connection between Dracula and vampirism. Stoker had his attention drawn to the blood-sucking vampires of Romanian folklore by Emily Gerard's article about Transylvanian superstitions, published in 1885. His limited knowledge about the medieval history of Wallachia came from William Wilkinson's book entitled Account of the Principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia with political observations relative to them, published in 1820. Stoker apparently did not know much about Vlad the Impaler, certainly not enough for us to say that Vlad was the inspiration for Count Dracula, according to Elizabeth Miller. For instance, Stoker wrote that Dracula had been of Szekely origin only because he knew about both Attila the Hun's destructive campaigns and the alleged Hunnic origin of the Szekelys. Stoker's main source, Wilkinson, who accepted the reliability of the German stories, described Vlad as a wicked man. Actually, Stoker's working papers for his book contain no references to the historical figure, the name of the character being named in all drafts but the later ones Count Wampy. Consequently, Stoker borrowed the name and scraps of miscellaneous information about the history of Wallachia when writing his book about Count Dracula. Raymond McNally's Dracula Was a Woman, 1983, suggests another historical figure as an inspiration, Elizabeth Bathory. McNally argues that the imagery of Dracula has analogues in Bathory's described crimes, such as the use of a cage resembling an Iron Maiden. Gothic critic and lecturer Marie Mulvey Roberts writes that vampires were traditionally depicted as mouldering revenants, who dragged themselves around graveyards. Buter like Bathory, Dracula uses blood to restore his youth. Recent scholarship has questioned whether Bathory's crimes were exaggerated by her political opponents, with others noting that very little is concretely known about her life. A book that Stoker used for research, The Book of Werewolves, does have some information on Bathory, but Miller writes that he never took notes on anything from the short section devoted to her. In a facsimile edition of Bram Stoker's original notes for the book, Miller and her co-author Robert Basang say in a footnote that there is no evidence she inspired Stoker. In 2000, Miller's book-length study, Dracula, Sense and Nonsense, was said by academic Noel Chevalier to correct not only leading Dracula scholars, but non-specialists and popular film and television documentaries. Aside from the historical, Count Dracula also has literary progenitors. Academic Elizabeth Signarotti argues that Dracula is a response to the lesbian vampire of Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla, 1872, correcting its emphasis on female desire. Bram Stoker's great-nephew, broadcaster Daniel Farson, wrote a biography of the author. In it, he doubts that Stoker was aware of the lesbian elements of Carmilla, but nonetheless notes that it influenced him profoundly. Farson writes that an inscription upon a tomb in Dracula is a direct allusion to Carmilla. Scholar Alison Milbank observes that as Dracula can transform into a dog, Carmilla can become a cat. According to author Patrick McGrath, traces of Carmilla can be found in the 3 female vampires residing in Dracula's castle. A short story written by Stoker and published after his death, Dracula's Guest, has been seen as evidence of Carmilla's influence. According to Milbank, the story was a deleted first chapter from early in the original manuscript, and replicates Carmilla's setting of Styria instead of Transylvania. Irish folklore has been suggested as a possible influence on Stoker. Bob Curran, a lecturer in Celtic history and folklore at the University of Ulster, Coleraine, suggests that Stoker may have drawn some inspiration for Dracula from an Irish vampire, Abhartach. There is a place in the parish of Airgill in Londonderry, called Slagtoverty, but it ought to have been called Lagtoverty, the lagged or sepulchral monument of the Abhartach, Abhartach, or dwarf. This dwarf was a magician, and a dreadful tyrant, and after having perpetrated great cruelties on the people he was at last vanquished and slain by a neighbouring chieftain, some say by Fian Mac Cumhale. He was buried in a standing posture, but the very next day he appeared in his old haunts, more cruel and vigorous than ever. And the chief slew him a second time and buried him as before, but again he escaped from the grave, and spread terror through the whole country. The chief then consulted a druid, and according to his directions, he slew the dwarf a third time, and buried him in the same place, with his head downwards, which subdued his magical power, so that he never again appeared on earth. The lag traced over the dwarf is still there, and you may hear the legend with much detail from the natives of the place, one of whom told it to me. Patrick Joyce, The Origin and History of Irish Names of Places, 1875. In some modern versions of the story, Abhartach rises from his grave to drink the blood of his subjects, while the chieftain who slays the revenant is named as Cuthane. The hero variously consults an early Christian saint instead of a druid, and is told that Abhartach is one of the Neem-Meb, or walking dead, and that he can only be restrained by killing him with a sword made of yew wood, burying him upside down, surrounding his grave with thorns, and placing a large stone on top of the grave. Oddly enough, a close acquaintance of Stoker's provided the source for the count. Sir Henry Irving, born 6 February 1838, died 13 October 1905, christened John Henry Brodrib, sometimes known as J. H. Irving, was an English stage actor in the Victorian era, known as an actor-manager because he took complete responsibility, supervision of sets, lighting, direction, casting, as well as playing the leading roles, for season after season at the West End's Lyceum Theatre, establishing himself and his company as representative of English classical theatre. In 1895 he became the first actor to be awarded a knighthood, indicating full acceptance into the higher circles of British society. From 1878, Bram Stoker worked for Irving as a business manager at the Lyceum. Stoker idolized Irving to the point that, as one contemporary remarked, to Bram, Irving is as a god, and can do no wrong. In the considered judgment of one biographer, Stoker's friendship with Irving was the most important love relationship of his adult life. Irving, however, was a self-absorbed and profoundly manipulative man. He enjoyed cultivating rivalries between his followers, and to remain in his circle required constant, careful courting of his notoriously fickle affections. When Stoker began writing Dracula, Irving was the chief inspiration for the title character. In his 2002 paper for the American Historical Review, Buffalo Bill Meets Dracula, William F. Cody, Bram Stoker, and the Frontiers of Racial Decay, Historian Louis S. Warren writes, "Scholars have long agreed that keys to the Dracula tale's origin and meaning lie in the manager's relationship with Irving in the 1880s. There is virtual unanimity on the point that the figure of Dracula, which Stoker began to write notes for in 1890, was inspired by Henry Irving himself." Stoker's numerous descriptions of Irving correspond so closely to his rendering of the fictional count that contemporaries commented on the resemblance. But Bram Stoker also internalized the fear and animosity his employer inspired in him, making them the foundations of his Gothic fiction.